Welcome to the 10th and final session of Fundamental Principles of Political Economy, based on the American classic Progress and Poverty by Henry George. The law of human progress explains why past civilizations arose and decayed, and which social adjustments tend to advance and which tend to retard civilization. The first essential to progress is association. It permits the division of labor with greater productivity and frees mental power for higher pursuits. The second essential to progress is equality, a condition of freedom and justice, lessens the wasteful expenditure of mental and physical power in conflict. The law of human progress is association in equality. Association frees human power for improvement. Equality prevents its dissipation in fruitless struggles. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the law of human progress. Now, I thought I would go through some of the history of this movement and say that Henry George, after he had written his books, ran for mayor of New York in 1886, when New York was only Manhattan. And some, and I think more than a few, historians believe that so many ballots were thrown in the East River by the Tammany Hall operatives that he actually won. But even though he was counted out, he still got way more votes than the third party candidate, who was Teddy Roosevelt, who was a three-way race. He ran again in 1897 after New York had become all 5 boroughs, and it is believed that he would definitely have won, but he died 4 days before the election. And it was reported that his funeral procession was second only to Abraham Lincoln's in New York City. So he was a really popular guy. He was born on what was the edge of Philadelphia, at 10th and Pine in Philadelphia. Now it's right on the edge of Center City. And on the right is a picture of his wife, Annie Fox, who came from Australia. Henry George had many predecessors who were in sync with what he believed. And in 1681, William Penn declared Pennsylvania a commonwealth, and the first tax in Pennsylvania was a land value tax. In 1690, John Locke said, God hath given the earth to men in common, yet every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands are properly his. That was in his work called On Civil Government. And William Blackstone, the earth, therefore, and all things therein are the general property of all mankind, from the immediate gift of the Creator. And that was from Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1765 to 1769. And here we have the founders of the Physiocratic School in 1758, who are the real fathers of political economy. And among them is Pierre Samuel Dupont, who was the president of the French National Assembly, and Dr. Francis Cunet, the king's physician, and Anne Robert Turgot, who was the minister of finance, and advocates of the impo unic, on the value of land. And of course, if you're from Delaware or nearby, you know that Pierre came to the United States and settled in Delaware, and they started, his son started the gunpowder thing, and he's buried right about 5 miles from Arden. Victor Mirabeau, the Marquis, ranked the proposition to substitute one tax on rent for all other taxes as a discovery equal to the inutility to the invention of writing or the substitution of the use of money for barter. Thomas Spence, Property and Land, Everyone's Right, in 1775, republished as The Rights of Man, the end of aristocracy and landlords. Land should be owned in common, parishes democratic and self-governing. Land rents, the only tax of any kind, to be shared equally, universal suffrage, including female, a socially guaranteed income for those unable to work, the rights of infants to be free from abuse and poverty. And Thomas Jefferson, the earth belongs usufruct to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. The portion occupied by an individual ceases to be his when himself ceases to be and reverts to society. Thomas Paine in 1795. Men did not make the earth. It is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. And William Ogilvy, described by his biographer as the Euclid of land law reform, was a Scottish classicist. And Wikipedia says, as with John Locke, Thomas Paine, and others, Ogilvy seen as a leading prototype of the Georgist thinker. His masterwork was republished in 1838, and then in 1891 as the heart and subject of a new, much larger work titled Birthright in Land. And Abraham Lincoln, the land, the earth God gave to man for his home, sustenance, and support, should never be the possession of any man, corporation, society, or unfriendly government any more than the air or water. And there were many people who endorsed Henry George in his work, and Mark Twain, who in 1865 employed Henry George as a ticket taker for a lecture given. They were friends in San Francisco, and if you've ever read his works, you'll see that Twain was very much influenced by Henry George. Edward Robeson Taylor helped Henry George write Progress and Poverty and became mayor of San Francisco. As mayor, he is credited with a miraculous rebuilding after the earthquake of 1906. The value of buildings burned, but because they had an accurate assessment of land, it provided much of the needed revenue. And in 1885, Tolstoy first reads Henry George. He said, "People do not argue with the teachings of George. They simply do not know it. It is impossible to do otherwise with his teachings, for he who becomes acquainted with it cannot help but agree." And Tom Johnson was mayor of Cleveland, at the time the 7th largest city in the United States. He was a streetcar magnate, congressman, and then he became the single tax mayor of Cleveland. And he was considered Cleveland was considered the best run city in America. He didn't get the land value tax adopted in Cleveland, but accurate assessments of land values discouraged speculation, and he was able to establish streetcars that were owned by the city and run at the cost, which today is standard in the United States and so on. Joseph Fels, the inventor of Fels Naphtha soap, spent millions and millions of dollars promoting the single tax, including holding the mortgage for the purchase of land to start the village of Arden. Winston Churchill, in 1909, he delivered speeches against land monopoly and for the taxation of land values. Sun Yat-sen read Progress and Poverty around 1897, the year Henry George died. The land value tax, as the only means of supporting the government, is infinitely just, reasonable, and an equitably distributed tax, and on it we will found our new system. He remains a unique character among 20th century Chinese leaders for having a high reputation in both the People's Republic of China and in Taiwan, where he is known as the father of the nation. And the Dover Jail Single Tax Club, part of the 1895 and 6 campaign to institute the single tax in Delaware. They were called depraved and irresponsible vagabonds, pests of society. They were arrested for blocking the sidewalk while giving speeches in the capital of Delaware, Dover. They gave thousands of speeches and spent something like $25,000, which was a lot of money in those days, and only got 3% of the vote. The newspaper said that what the Republicans were paying to buy votes, the money could have bought them a lot more votes than they actually got. At about the same time, there were people like Henry Hetzel, Frank and Don Stevens, Edwin and Will Ross, Arthur Stevenson, Haynes Albright, and C.F. Chandru, who were members of this worldwide movement pictured above, and they all ended up in the village of Arden. Founded primarily by Frank Stevens with the help of Will Price, the famous architect, and I should mention that Frank Stevens, as a young man, was with Henry George when he died. Samuel Seabury, Justice of the New York Supreme Court, and famous for bringing about the resignation of New York's corrupt mayor, Jimmy Walker, in the 1930s. To the editor of the New York Times, he wrote, "I compared the institution of private property and land with the institution of chattel slavery, and stated that the crime of private property and land was greater than that of chattel slavery." Aldous Huxley, if I were to rewrite this book, Brave New World, I would offer a third alternative. The possibility of sanity and economics would be Georgist. John Dewey, professor of philosophy at Columbia University and one of the founders of the New School in the city of New York. No graduate of a higher educational institution has a right to regard himself as an educated man in social thought unless he has some firsthand acquaintance with the theoretical contribution of Henry George. And I might say that Beards, the historians, were also founding members of the New School and followers of Henry George. Clarence Darrow, famous for the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, the single tax is so simple, so fundamental, and so easy to carry into effect that I have no doubt it will be about the last land reform the world will ever get. William Burgess, MD, he directed the mosquito control program that enabled the completion of the Panama Canal, was president of the American Medical Association in 1909 and 10, and endorsed the single tax because of its public health benefits. Jane Addams, founder of the Hull House and Settlement House movement, championed labor rights, women's rights, peace, and the single tax. Addams was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1931. Helen Keller, who reads shall find in Henry George's philosophy a rare beauty and power of inspiration, a splendid faith in the essential nobility of human nature. And Louis Brandeis, Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1916 to 1939, believed in the taxation of land values only. Molly Ivins says Henry George must be in his grave spinning like a cyclotron. We, the people at large, make the land more desirable, and then the landowners want us to pay them because we won't allow them to poison the air or to pollute the rivers. That was as recently as 1995. In a 1990 letter, Gorbachev was urged not to privatize land, only the improvements. By collecting land rent, the government would have ample revenue and no need for taxes. It was signed by 21 professors of economics, 4 of them Nobel laureates, 1 president of the American Economic Association, and the senior research economist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I am often asked why the single tax has never been enacted. And I believe the simple answer is almost nobody knows about it. I've taught these classes hundreds of times to thousands of people in many different formats for more than 50 years. And not enough of them, the students, have passed these basic concepts on to have an awareness of them expand exponentially, which is really all that is needed. I believe it is a combination of several factors, that is to say, the reason they have not passed this information on. I think most people do not have the self-confidence to be sure that there isn't a flaw in the thesis. Few people want to be ostracized and isolated from their friends and their community as an anti-American or some sort of communist. And few people want to whip a dead horse. They are sure that the landowners, as the most powerful group in the country, will never let the single tax go into effect. And so they work for a more kinder, gentler form of wage slavery, raising the minimum wage and making Social Security secure and advocating for national health care and a myriad of welfare programs. That is the end of the lesson for tonight, and I have a talk to give. Anybody want to make a comment or a question or say anything?
Yeah, I'd like to make two quick comments.
Good.
One is earlier when you mentioned Tom Johnson, the mayor of Cleveland, and you included a picture of the statue of him that's in Cleveland. Just want to mention, for those that haven't heard it, that statue of Tom Johnson, in it, he's holding a book, Progress in Poverty. So if you ever get over to Cleveland, go visit the statue of Tom Johnson. You can see the book is Progress in Poverty. The other comment I had was—
Let me just thank you for saying that, because it's funny, I had intended to say that and totally forgot. Thank you very much. Henry George, your time is now. What's it like to be a Georgist, and can we bridge the left and right divide? I do believe the single tax would solve our most intractable problems. Enough jobs for everyone who needs to work, with wages that provide for a decent standard of living, including the cost of housing. No other programs offer an alternative, independent opportunity in the struggle for a place to live and earn a living. But how on earth do we convince the majority of Americans that the single tax really is an option, that it will solve our problems, and it is fair for all Americans? It's now been over 50 years since I became an advocate, and if I really knew how to get the single tax adopted, of course, I would have done it long, long ago. Nonetheless, I'd like to share some insights. I believe the country has always been divided between liberals who thought the government could intervene in the production and distribution of wealth for the benefit of the people, and conservatives who thought that the role of government was to preserve the right of property and ensure the freedom of all to compete in the market. Everyone believes in democracy when they're in the majority, and no one really believes in democracy when they're in the minority and they feel their freedoms and assets are being threatened. One group now believes that government must intervene and redistribute wealth and benefits, or a large segment of the people will suffer from extreme poverty. At the same time, the other group believes with equal conviction that it is the interventions and redistributions of wealth that have caused unemployment, inefficiencies, and a lack of affordable housing. Therefore, what is needed is the right of property and the freedom to cooperate as consenting adults. A few years ago, I tried to engage a working class conservatives on the unequal distribution of wealth. That is when he asked me, did I ever hear of a poor person creating jobs? I was tempted to ask him if he ever heard of a rich person creating land, but I really knew he thought that jobs were the sole creation of rich people's investments. Today, I am haunted by the prophetic words of Henry George. In 1879, he said, given a community with Republican institutions in which one class rolls in wealth and the many seethe with discontent at a condition of things they know not how to remedy, and power must pass into the hands of demagogues who will seize and wield it for a time, only to be displaced by worse demagogues. The accidents of hereditary succession may sometimes place the wise and just in power. But in a corrupt democracy, the tendency is always to give power to the worst. A corrupt democratic government must finally corrupt the people. And when the people become corrupt, there is no resurrection. Close quote. Well, the system wasn't and isn't totally corrupt, but it is fundamentally corrupt. The foundation of American capitalism is private property and land, and that institution is reinforced with every shift to income and sales taxes. It is true, there is no free land. Therefore, most taxes are paid out of what would otherwise go to the owners of land and other monopolies. But income taxes, sales taxes levy no direct penalty for land speculation, which is the cause of unemployment, unaffordable housing, and the reason why wages tend to a minimum below which the value of land would fall as well. We've intervened with the minimum wage, and by some estimates, we are redistributing $1 trillion a year with an array of welfare programs at every level of government, simply because there aren't enough jobs, wages are so low, and housing is what the market will bear instead of what it costs to provide it. And in spite of $1 trillion spent each year on welfare, poverty and the fear of poverty are still with us. Why wouldn't the coal miners, assembly line workers, and every other semi-skilled person vote for Trump or someone like him? He actually promised them something. They heard the Democrats and their concern for the poor illegal immigrants and their children who wanted to go to college, and the refugees who fled from the wars and chaos in the Middle East. And all the while, they, as American citizens, were working at dead-end jobs or unemployed, and our government did very little or nothing to help them. After 12 years and millions of new jobs being created, the country finally attained about the same percentage of the adult population that was working before the recession began in 2007. And then came the pandemic. So nothing has really changed. The $7.25 federal minimum wage buys less of the basics than the minimum wage bought in 1950. During the last 40 years, productivity has increased by 100%, while the majority of workers got just 10% more in their pay. And while Wall Street rolls in dough, inflation takes more than the banks pay in interest. With every increase in productivity, wages and interest are becoming a smaller portion of what's produced, and there is never enough land sold that all the people who represent the increase in population and those who were replaced by machines can work and afford a decent living. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are in greater need of assistance. Henry George, your time is now. Now, if you've ever been to a Henry George conference, you will notice that there are just about as many extreme conservatives as bleeding heart liberals. I am sure every newcomer is perplexed. They are wondering, what in the world are these right-wing reactionaries doing at a Henry George conference? And the conservative newcomer has an equally visceral reaction. What in the hell are these damn socialists doing at a Henry George conference? And the answer is, we all agree on one thing. The rental value of land is a natural and just source of public revenue. That is it. But it is the one thing that all liberals and conservatives can agree on without compromise, as long as they understand the nature of land. So how do we advocate the same single tax program to both groups and still be in sync with what they believe? What can we say to the Bernie Sanders supporters that also resonates with the followers of DeSantis without alienating those who voted for Biden? How can we present the single tax and reach the 99% of the people? We often see other movements succeeding and wonder, what can we learn from them? Can we replicate their success? How about Nelson Mandela? Wasn't he one of the most successful leaders for social change? The fact that he was just slightly ahead of the people he was leading is considered a key element in his success. Well, we're not even in the realm of the people we hope to lead. Most Americans believe that everyone should contribute a portion of their income or wealth to the support of the government. At one extreme, they want the government to fund legislation, the infrastructure, police, courts, prisons, and the military. That is it. At the other extreme, they also want the government to fund education, retirement, healthcare, and a basic income for all. And they want the rich to pay progressively more to fund it. I get no indication there is any political awareness that land is a natural opportunity or that the increase and concentration of population increases its value. Everyone knows that the infrastructure is necessary to the increase in population, that it enables efficient cooperation. But with the exception of land speculators and a few economists, there seems to be no general awareness that public investment in infrastructure and public service ultimately end up in the value of land. Is it any wonder they don't want to recuperate those expenditures with a tax on the value of land? Neither the left nor the right has consciously considered a moral basis of ownership. The dichotomy between the equal opportunity of land and the exclusive ownership of wealth. Nor is any distinction made between the values produced by individuals or corporations and those created by society as a whole. What George believed is the requisite to human progress. The right seems to think we already have an equal opportunity, and what is produced by public expenditures is pretty much enjoyed equally by everyone right now. At the same time, the left fails to distinguish between an equal right to nature and freedom and an obligation of other people to provide for them with education and healthcare. They talk as though the return to capital, buildings, machinery is the exploitation of labor. And we as Georgists say, no, land is the primary source of unwarranted income. But it isn't so easy to see. The blue-collar worker isn't employed on an empty lot. He's working in a factory with millions or even billions of dollars worth of capital, buildings, machinery, inventory. People look at a car factory or a high-rise building in the middle of Manhattan. In both cases, there may well be a vacant lot of equal size that's sitting right next door. The vacant lot isn't yielding any income. It's just sitting there. It's the car factory with all this machinery or the high-rise tower that's bringing in all the money. They see the capitalist, not the landowner who's getting rich. What we have to show is that the owner of a building alone would not tend to profit more than the lender of money or the owner of corporate bonds. It is when buildings are added to land that there is a far greater income than the total of the land and the buildings separately by themselves could possibly yield. And that synergy results from the infrastructure and the mutual support of all the people and all the activities in the surrounding area. And because it only results on land where population is dense and the infrastructure supports a super cooperation, all the surplus is taken by the owners of land. Our program creates jobs, increases the supply of housing, and provides needed revenue. When it becomes a national policy, it will raise wages and the return on savings and productive competitive investments. And there aren't any trade-offs like permitting pollution and CO2 emissions. We stand for equal opportunity and a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, just like all other Americans. For the right, we are not about redistributing wealth from those who have it to those who don't. We are definitely about limiting government. We stand for private property and everything that is produced by individuals and corporations and free enterprise. We want to abolish all confiscatory taxes and replace them with a charge that simply requires everyone to pay the free market value of the benefits they receive from the government, nothing more. We support the government's exclusive assignment of natural resources to individuals and corporations, for without it, there would be no way for people to keep securely what they produce, their crops, houses, factories, and office towers. But with the title to land comes the obligation to pay to the community and society its rental value. In fact, we propose to run the government like a business. When governments function well, it increases productivity and it increases the rental value of land. Therefore, we propose to collect that value for public purpose. For the left, the payment of rent clearly shares the socially created wealth that liberals imagine and advocate in the graduated income tax. The rent of land, which includes mineral land and the airwaves, is a source of revenue that measures exactly the value of the benefits that every landholder receives from the government. It represents a socially created synergy that comes from the conscious and subconscious cooperation of the community as a whole. It is enhanced by public investment in the infrastructure, preservation of order, and the administration of justice. And from that portion of the socially created fund, which exceeds the cost of government, provision can be made for the sick, the aged, and the helpless. It is from this surplus that our nation could fund national health care, Social Security, education, and medical research. It could even provide for a basic income that would go to all. Now, whenever we have done a good job of explaining the single tax, or even a shift from taxing buildings to the value of land in a single city, their first reaction is that little voice that says, if it sounds too good to be true, it almost certainly is. I must have missed something, because everybody knows there is no such thing as a magic bullet or a really free lunch. Do you mean to tell me that in all our universities, no one can figure out that what you are telling me is true? The idea that we could raise wages by shifting our taxes sounds like a passage from Alice in Wonderland. They have no idea that land cannot be justified as property, or that it causes a shortage of housing and jobs. They can't imagine a free land opportunity like the Homestead Acts of the 19th century. Keep in mind, this ain't no ordinary proposal. We are not only advocating the overthrow of our aristocracy, which includes the people who own the newspapers, the airwaves, and our politicians, but we are also saying to the majority of Americans, they must give up the one thing that has gotten them off the treadmill of life. We are promising that their wages and the return on their savings will increase, that there will be no taxes on income, sales, or their house itself, that they will be far better off with a single tax than they are right now. And some people think we just might be right, but few people have the confidence that we are. What they do know for sure is that because they own a house, no one can ever raise their rent. And the more time has passed since they got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, the more they can afford to go out for dinner, take a vacation, send their kids to college, and actually retire when they get to 65 or 70. And if they can get their real estate taxes reduced, that is a very big plus. While renters are paying 10 and 20% on bank loans and credit cards, the homeowner knows that he can borrow pretty much whatever money he wants for 3 or 4% plus inflation. Is it any wonder the masses don't come right out and join our chorus? Even among those who are sure we are right, how many of them think the 1% and the 0.1% will ever let the single tax become a reality? Neither the logic of our arguments nor the power of our personalities is enough. Look at the advocates who have preceded us. Were Winston Churchill or Supreme Court Justice Brandeis any less credible than the best among us now? Were Tolstoy or Darrow any less persuasive? I used to think that a few Socratic questions would get people on board, but I found that people would not admit they couldn't even defend the most basic principles of their own left or right ideology. It isn't until you offer people a course in political economy that you realize the majority of people don't want to study social problems. They want to elect a savior who will fix them. Now, I'm sure that some ways of promoting our program are more effective than others, but I don't believe there are any shortcuts. Even when you get a city like Harrisburg to adopt a good measure of land value taxation with a commensurate success in creating urban revival, jobs, housing, slum rehabilitation, and needed revenue. There are always other policies in play, and most people don't see that only the cities with land value taxation are the ones that turned around. Nonetheless, our proposal does bridge the left and right divide. It makes clear just what is required to provide an equal opportunity, which the left and the right both adamantly proclaim. It incorporates the principle of the right that those values produced by individuals and corporations belong to their producers. It incorporates the principle of the left that socially created values belong to the community and society as a whole. So, with the proper emphasis, we offer a moral justification for each of these positions, and we create the possibility of adding people from the left and the right to our movement. I often think a political party could get our thesis into the public dialogue. The people who didn't vote in the last two elections could have elected anyone they wanted. But I keep hearing Henry George, as he says, social reform is not to be secured by noise and shouting, by complaints and denunciations, by the forming of parties or the making of revolutions, but by the awakening of thought and the progress of ideas. The great work of the present for every man and every organization of men who would improve social conditions is the work of education. Of course, it is true. If we don't stop polluting the air and water, we will be a third world country. If we don't stop global warming, the planet will become uninhabitable. If we don't prevent nuclear war, there won't be any other problems. But what are the chances the hungry will worry about pollution, the unemployed about global warming, the homeless about nuclear war? And yet, can anyone imagine a person who is assured an opportunity to work, own a house, and enjoy a decent life for themselves and their posterity, who wouldn't be concerned with pollution, global warming, and nuclear war? The single tax really is the only thing that can prevent them. As Margaret Mead, the outspoken sociologist, once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. The truth that I have tried to make clear, said George, will not find easy acceptance. If that could be, it would have been accepted long ago. If that could be, it would have never been obscured. But it will find friends, those who will toil for it, suffer for it, if need be, die for it. This is the power of truth. Will it at length prevail? Ultimately, yes. But in our own times, or in times of which any memory of us remains, who shall say? Thank you.